Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Total Directory Resolution, Mitigate Directory Accuracy Challenges by Addressing Large and Delegated Groups, presented by LexisNexis and the American Medical Association. I'm Lisi Feliciano, today's event moderator, and on behalf of LexisNexis and the American Medical Association, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. Before we launch into the main presentation, I'd like to go over a few brief housekeeping items. First, today's event is being recorded. We will email you a link to the on-demand recording so you can view the presentation again later or share it with a colleague. Please disable your pop-up blocker to ensure that you have no trouble viewing the slides or any of the links present in today's event. It's an interactive event, so we'd like to encourage everyone to submit questions using the question and answer box feature found in your console. If you'd like to enlarge the slides, you may do so by dragging the corner of the box. If you have any other technical difficulties during the webinar that I have not covered, you can press Control Function 5 to refresh your screen. If that does not work, please feel free to reach out using the Q&A box. Finally, at the end of the event, we will present you with a brief survey. We'd appreciate if you would take a moment to complete the survey and let us know your thoughts on today's events. Now I'd like to introduce our featured speakers. Our first speaker is Dara Price-Olson. Dara is the Senior Director of Market Planning for LexisNexis Healthcare and is responsible for the Provider Data Intelligence suite of solutions, which includes all of the provider information-related products and services. In this role, Dara leads a team who defines, designs, implements, and innovates on all of the LexisNexis provider data management and accuracy-focused products. She also spent over 10 years with client service responsibility, working directly with over 20 payers and plans to coach and advise them on data usage. Our second presenter today is Sue Wilson, Director of Database Products and Business Development with the American Medical Association Business Solutions. Sue serves both the American Medical Association and its wholly owned subsidiary, American Medical Association Business Solutions, as the Director of Database Product Business Development. Her responsibilities include the development, management, and support of the prospect and customer relationships that leverage the AMA's 100-year-plus-old physician demographic database, known as the Master File. Sue has over 20 years of experience in working with financial and healthcare data. Prior to joining the American Medical Association, Sue held positions with Experian, Hart Hanks, R.R. Donnelley, and Sons. With that, I will now pass it over to you, Dara.
Hey, thank you, Lisi. And also just want to thank the participants for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time. As Lisi said, today we're going to talk about total directory resolution and specifically get into the hard-to-address areas of the large and delegated groups. But before we actually get into it, I just want to share my personal experience recently with directory accuracy. So probably like you, I went through my enrollment process as a member in November, right? And I went into our application provided by our benefits, part of the organization, and I decided to take this path called Help Me Choose. And in this Help Me Choose app, I had the option to put in my 5 providers that my family uses, and I was able to put in the 4 prescription that my family uses. And then based on that, this little module came back with some recommended plans for me to choose from. 2 of the plans came from one payer, and they were different metal levels. And then the 3rd plan came from an altogether different payer. The first 2 were actually coming in at about $200 less than the 3rd one. So it was kind of, and that was my out-of-pocket piece of it. So it was kind of a big decision for me, $200 less per month, actually, that it would have made a difference for me out of pocket to choose the 3rd plan versus the first 2. And the difference between those is that 4 of my 5 providers were in the cheaper plan, and 5 of my 5 providers were in the more expensive plan. And I'm sitting there looking at my options, right? And knowing what I know about what various payers are doing with the directories, I actually knew that the first two products were coming from a payer that was working with us. I knew exactly what it was that they were doing with regard to their directory accuracy. I really didn't know what the other payer was doing at all. So I actually called up my husband and said, you know, Chris, how important is it to you that we have Dr. Beck in network? Because it's going to cost us $200 more a month out of our pocket in order to get him in network. And he said, oh, well, Dara, he's like, he's retired. So I was like, oh, well, that's really good to know then. I don't want to pay an extra $200 per month in order to get access to a writer who's actually retired. So it's just very interesting because we're going to talk about directory accuracy in a really abstract way today. But in fact, it actually touches people very personally, right out of their pocketbook. Okay. I thought I heard a question there for a second, but we'll go ahead and move on. So while there are a lot of aspects that we could talk about on the subject of directory accuracy, what we're actually going to do today is anchor this whole conversation around the recent CMS MAO audits and then the observations that they came out with for root causes for inaccuracy. And then we'll actually go into some approaches for addressing those challenges. And also today, as Lacey said, Sue Wilson with our partner at the AMA, she'll actually talk about the provider's perspective and supply some insights based on a recent survey of providers that they have access to. Okay, so as you know, nearly every state now has regulation and requirements for directory elements and accuracy. If a state didn't create a version of their own, they at least borrowed or copied from another state or a set of guidelines. And while there are some differences between them, the fundamentals of those requirements are pretty similar and pretty consistent, actually, with what we're seeing for CMS requirements, at least at the base level. That said, though, to date, CMS has by far been the most proactive in measuring and publishing results. And they have also provided a little more by way of insight and coming out with what they believe to be causes and corresponding recommendations. So for that reason, we're actually going to focus today on their review results. And while they are only auditing MAOs, we believe that their findings seem to resonate, at least at a base level, across most types of provider directories. So let's just go back in time a bit. As you probably remember, CMS first came out with their call letter in 2015, which highlighted their concerns and their expectations with regard to directory accuracy. Then in 2016, they completed the first of 3 intended MAO reviews, with the plan of reviewing the first third in 2016, the second third in 2017, and the third third in 2018. They published their round 1 results in early 2017, and now just recently they published their round 2 results earlier this year. So if it's safe to assume that they'll follow the same pattern, that's why these are asterisked here with these kind of future dates. If it's safe to assume they'll continue in this rhythm, then they're probably right now in the midst of their final third of MAO review, with those likely to be complete by mid-year toward the end of summer. CMS has said that they believe that by mid-2019, they will have given the MAOs, quote, ample time to address directory accuracy, given that their first call letter was in 2015 and they've conducted 3 years of review. They actually are starting to give signs and indications that they intend to start finding in 2019. You might have seen that CMS just released its advanced guidance that describes the proposed civil monetary penalty formulas for provider directory violation. So it does look like they're getting down to math on how those fines would be calculated. So they are, like I say, giving every indication that they're going to be fining next year. And my guess is that the review cycle generating those fines would begin around September of this year if they continue on their current review pattern. So let's go into kind of what their audit process looks like. It starts with their sampling methodology, right? So they start by pulling equal samplings of PCPs, cardiologists, oncologists, and ophthalmologists, which are, of course, the provider types that are most relevant to their Medicare Advantage population. When I compared their round 2 methodology with their round 1 methodology, they were very consistent on this point. They seem to do this exactly the same way. Then, once they have their provider population, they pulled all the locations for each of those provider sampled, which actually starts to shift the balance of the overall population slightly toward cardiologists at 30%, and then also slightly toward the ophthalmologists with 27%. Then if you do the math to get the location to provider ratio, what you see is, at least in their sampling, 2.2 locations per provider on average. You can see that cardiologists here in the red come in slightly above average at around 2.6 locations per provider, while the PCPs come in below average at around 1.7 locations per provider, which really makes sense, right? So I'm highlighting this here because this number ends up becoming really important to us later in the presentation. So to remember that number, it's 2.2 average location providers as seen in the CMS review process. Okay, so once they have their sample set of providers and their locations, then, as I'm sure you know, they make a series of calls to those locations, and they're evaluating against 11 different deficiency types. Super interesting, of all of these 11 deficiencies, 3 of them actually make up the bulk of the deficiencies that they identify, which is 79%. So let's just kind of go through this slowly. If you look at the teal on the left side, 41% of the deficiencies identified are that the provider shouldn't be listed at that directory, or that in the directory at that location. Moving down to the orange, 19% is that the provider shouldn't be listed in the directory at any location. Okay? Moving around to the blue, 19% where the phone number needed to be updated, such that they weren't even able to connect on the phone number provided. And then all the rest of the deficiencies combined make up 27 or 21% of all the deficiencies, and that includes everything, all the other ones, the specialty, the panel status, the suite number, the name changes, all of the other ones. So bottom line is that 60% of the time, you could say that the doctor is not in at that particular location, and 79% overall, the deficiencies are related to just the basics of provider location and phone, not even getting down to plan participation. So super, super interesting findings. So the net result here is that despite the focus, the time and the effort and energy that so many parties are putting toward this initiative, second round results were actually worse than the first one. This is a graph of the deficiencies. The deficiencies went up from 45.1 in round 1 to 52.2 in round 2. Now, I only want to caveat that CMS does say that there's some differences in the review methodology, but fundamentally, when you look at it in detail, it's largely the same process that they followed, evaluating against the same criteria. So this clearly tells us that more work needs to be done here. So, because addressing directory accuracy really requires both the payer and provider collaboration, the AMA recently conducted a survey of providers to gain some insight into their level of understanding and support of these directory accuracy-related initiatives. I'm going to turn it over to Sue Wilson for this next section.
Thank you, Dara. Appreciate that. Really interesting information. And on the heels of that second CMS audit, which Dara just finished referencing, the American Medical Association surveyed some 700 plus physicians across the U.S., as Dara referenced, regarding their experience with network directories. And you'll notice here that 43% of them identified Medicare as one of the payers that they work with, meaning that they're impacted by the CMS regulations. And that 65% did not participate in an IPA, which we point out because we recognize that IPAs go about this a bit differently. And the results show that physicians and health plans absolutely must work together to eliminate potential barriers to care, because as today, our patients are relying on what is essentially outdated, inaccurate, or incomplete directory data to locate an in-network physician. Now, mandates aside, you can see here that 52% of the physicians surveyed say that their patients encounter coverage issues due to inaccurate directories. And as a result, we have a patient who is unhappy really with both the physician and the payer. As Dara referenced, they're likely to incur out-of-pocket expenses for which they are not prepared. So we've actually heard lots from payers that their response rates to these requests are going down, yet we're hearing from practices that they're being barraged with requests from a multitude of health plans, and honestly, they can't keep up with them. And while the physicians and their patients understand the importance of the data being accurate, you'll see here that 89% confirm that this is something that's important to their practice. 73% of them are not really aware of the legislative requirements for payers to conduct this outreach for them to attest to their information on a regular basis. Kind of startling, actually. And our survey also included important process-oriented questions, and this slide illustrates the wide variety of media and channels being used to collect and confirm this information. Now, it's interesting, just the other day I spoke to an IPA group who uses their credentialing software to collect and maintain this data. And on a monthly basis, they output the information to Excel and then reformat it to each of their 26 payers' specifications. You can do the math on the impact that these requirements have for this particular group. She also went on to explain that she has to sometimes reclassify some of their information, an example of which would be that some payers view an OB-GYN as a primary care physician, while others categorize them as a specialist. So she's reformatting, reclassifying, and adding or subtracting variables for each of her payers prior to submitting her information to them. And we understand that there may be good reasons for these differences, but if you put yourself in the shoes of the physicians and their practices, you can see that this might be difficult or would in fact be difficult to keep up with. So it's our belief that the way attestation is being managed today is not sustainable for physicians and their practices. which is why we were not surprised to see that they're interested in consolidating these activities into one interface. They're looking for relief from duplicative data verification requests. To summarize, 52%, my apologies, of those surveyed have had a patient that's been impacted at least once a month from inaccurate directory data. 89% acknowledge that it's important that the data be kept accurate, yet 73% know nothing about the mandates that the payers are facing, and there are a number of channels and media being used by physicians in their practices to collect and update this information. But 2/3 of those are interested in standardizing the process to update and send the information for these requests. And it's our feeling that there is a better way to approach this process. And Dara, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk more about that.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much, Sue. Let's go ahead and move into where CMS goes toward the end of their report. They start talking a little bit about the root causes, which kind of provides some insight and clues on, the better way, as Sue alludes to, right? So if you look at the closing pages of the Round 2 report, CMS outlines what they called 3 common drivers of deficiency based on their experience performing these reviews. So rather than read it word for word, I've actually paraphrased here. So the first one, number 1, groups are listing providers at a location because the group has an office there, even if the given provider rarely or never sees patients at that location. So this is a concept that I've actually been referring to as roster inflation, which is where providers are being represented at locations where they can provide coverage but don't actually go to on a regular basis. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in some of the upcoming slides. We're going to talk about what this is, how often it happens, and a little bit into why it happens. Okay, the deficiency driver number 2 is that MAOs are placing full faith in credentialing services, vendor support, and even in provider responses, which they consider to be unreliable practices. So I don't know about you, but I find this to be a very discouraging point because these are the very methods that payers have been relying on to make strides on their directory accuracy. And really what CMS is saying here is that these are not methods that you can trust. So let's go ahead and look toward deficiency driver number 3 to see if that's a little more helpful. Okay, the last point they make is that MAOs are assuming they'll be informed of a needed change, and they're saying that you can't assume that. They suggest that MAOs proactively reach out and use the data available, such as claims, to identify inactivity, which that is actually a super interesting point. I mean, something that really resonates with us at LexisNexis after years of working with customers on the subject of directory accuracy. It really does speak to some of the conclusions that we've been coming to, and it's an area where we've been focusing a lot of our effort in addition to kind of the outreach activities related to these mandates. So in the rest of this session, we're going to delve further into why the first deficiency has such a huge impact on total directory accuracy, and we're going to show how the data available, including claims and encounter data, can be applied in a useful way. So first, let's talk a little bit about rosters. Sue was describing the IPAs and the rosters that they're distributing on a regular basis. And we're actually hearing from payer contacts that large practices, groups, and delegated groups are often sending their information via some sort of roster process as well. So I'd like to just take a minute and poll our participants today to see if that's true for this group of people. Lacey?
Great. Thanks, Dara. So we'd like to ask a question. How many rosters do you receive from provider groups today? None, fewer than 50, 50 to 100, or over 100? Go ahead and begin to submit your responses. We'll give you a few moments, and then we will take a look at the results. I'll also use this as an opportunity to remind you that you can submit your questions using the Q&A box found there in your console. We will allow for a few minutes at the end of the presentation to address those questions, so feel free to submit them throughout. Give you a few more moments here. And let's see how the results are coming in. You can still submit. Dara, there you go. Those are the responses. Any insights from what you're seeing here?
So it looks like the majority of the participants are getting at least some. About 34% are getting at least over 50. You know, we've actually talked, it really does vary client by client and how big your plan and network is and how many you're receiving. We've worked with customers that are receiving thousands, and it does just vary depending on how big you are. So let's go ahead and talk about this a little bit further. I'm going to advance to the next slide. All right. So let's break down a typical provider directory to understand more about this roster effect. First, I'm sure you know, or as you all know, not all participating providers are part of a directory, right? The hospitalists, the anesthesiologists, the emergency medicine, they're not actually directory-facing providers. So kind of take those out of the picture. And when you are left with the remainder, they roughly break out like this. And this is based on our conversations with a number of payers, most of them on the larger side, right, versus local and regional players. But this is what they're telling us, and this is based on a lot of the data that we've seen. So first, let's talk about what we have here is we have 30% is related to the direct network, solo, and small groups. That's in the lighter orange. Then we have 30% that's related to the direct network, large groups. And by our definition, a large group is any group that has more than 10 provider location combinations. And then this dark orange is 40% related to delegated providers or delegated groups. That is at a high level what we've been seeing with customers and data that we've been working with. So let's just talk first about this, the solo and small groups, this 30%. This population is by far the most straightforward when it comes to doing any kind of outreach and getting verification and response. There, you can pretty much outreach by almost any channel and it'll work, right? This next group, this lighter color down at the bottom, this 30% is more difficult actually to contact and receive confirmation and update. Because number one, they're way too large to fax. You can't possibly be faxing, groups with more than 10 provider locations and expect a response on that. They're way too large to call. You can't get them on the phone and expect them to spend, multiple minutes per provider location reviewing this information with you. The third point is they may or may not be willing to review and update the information that you are showing for them. Because number four, they may be sending you rosters for you to integrate and apply. and they see it as your responsibility to integrate and update based on the rosters they're sending you versus their responsibility to review what you have. And then the other point is the roster that they're sending you may not actually include all the information that is required for some directories. It might not be including languages for the provider or languages for the practice or some of the accessibility options that are required. And then lastly, for anyone that you're doing rosters for, you might not have great processes for updating based on their provided information, at least maybe not great automated processes to do it. This last 40% here that we're showing, the last 40% that's delegated, this group a lot of times has all the same issues that you have with the direct network large groups, but they can also have additional complications where the delegate, since they're holding the contract with the provider versus you, they may not be feasible for you to reach out directly to those providers and confirm the information because this abstracted relationship that's happening through the delegate. And then the last point is if you go to the delegated group to get the information, they might not have the most up-to-date information about a provider because sometimes they're only getting updated information during a credentialing cycle. So the bottom line is that about 70% of a typical directory can be extremely vulnerable to the first two deficiencies that CMS outlined. Let's move on to talk more about what I'm calling group roster inflation, what it is, and how often it appears to be happening. Okay, so this is a very simple illustration. It's exaggerated for effect, but in some cases, it's not too far from the truth. So groups, as you know, often have multiple service locations. And those are those going across the top. And they often have multiple providers. Those are shown going down the left. And again, this is a slight exaggeration, but because any group provider could provide service or coverage at any location, the group roster lists every provider at every location, which is shown here by all of the green check marks, even if a given provider only regularly sees patients at some of these locations. So in my example here, I'm showing each provider at 3 to 4 locations, in some cases 2 here, but you can see the top provider listed. I'm showing that provider at the first location, the third location, and the fourth location. So I'd like to just take a minute. If you remember CMS, when they did their polls of providers and their corresponding locations, the ratio of provider locations to providers was 2.2 locations per provider. So I'd just like to take a minute to poll the group to see what you think is a reasonable number to be showing in your directory for any given provider in terms of where a provider would actually be seeing patients. Let's move on to that polling question, Lacey.
Great. So the question to the audience is, the average number of locations per provider in the CMS round 2 review was 2.2. How many locations per provider seem reasonable to include in a directory? Options are 1 to 2 locations, 3 to 4, 5 to 10, or over 10. You can begin submitting your response. We'll give the audience a few moments. And again, please submit your questions through the Q&A box located in the console, and we'll be happy to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the live event. Okay, let's see how the results are coming in. And there you go, Dara.
Okay, that's super interesting. So we're showing that some of our participants think it's reasonable to be showing providers at over 10 locations, and some even are saying more than 5 locations. But the bulk of our responders are thinking that the reasonable number for a provider to be showing in a directory is up to 4 locations. So let's go ahead and look. We analyzed about 4,000. See here. Yeah, okay. Okay. We actually analyzed 4,000 of the large groups that we received data for today. These are groups with over 10 provider location combinations. So what we found in this analysis that about 17% of the roster data appears to be inflated, showing each provider at 5 or more locations. So you can see these top 2 parts of the pie chart, the kind of ugly yellow and the gray. Those 2 together are 17% of the overall large group data, and that is where they're being shown at over 5 locations. Then you have the remainder that clearly the 1 location per provider is not going to be inflated. Probably the 2 locations per provider is not inflated. The 3 and 4 might have some inflation, but most likely the yellow has a good deal of inflation and the gray is probably heavily inflated. So I actually took a look for one of these, right? I wanted to see one in detail to see if I could really understand what's going on for one of these groups that's listing over 10 locations per provider. So I pulled one. Okay. Here's an actual example group. This is a group in the Southwest region. This is the information that they're providing for publication in directories to a payer today. Group has 52 providers and 41 service locations. So if you just straight up do the math and you say, if every provider were listed at every location, that would be 2,132 directory listings. They're actually currently showing 2,052 directory listings for this group, which averages 39.5 locations per provider. So if you take a minute and think about that, what that means is that for providers to be actually seeing patients at all these locations, they would be spending a half a day at each location per month and no more than that, which really doesn't make sense for probably anyone but a radiologist, right? And even they aren't actually seeing patients and probably don't belong in your directory in the first place, right? So just to give a little visual of what this looks like. This is kind of using the same model where service locations are represented across the top. To make this fit to the screen, I just used the city name of those service locations. This actually is more. It's a total of the 41. But then we have the providers here. I'm showing their last name going down the left-hand side. And everywhere where they're being shown in the directory is marked with a green box, which, as you can see, this entire thing looks like an aerial view of a football field or something, right? Almost every possible location is being listed. So, I mean, this just doesn't look right to me for a directory. I just don't know how this could possibly be right, that all of these providers are seeing patients on a regular basis at all of these service locations. So it's just very interesting situation. So it begs the question, why is this happening, and why is it being supplied in this information or in this way, or why is it showing up on directories, and what could you do about it? Because looking at this, how would you know, how would any payer know, looking at this, which ones are the ones that belong on the directory? You can't throw the entire group out and exclude the entire group from your directory, but how do you know which ones are safe to publish? Okay. Let's move on a little bit into kind of the approach. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of why this happens. It does seem to be a mix of things that are going on, both on the provider side as well as on the payer side. From that practice or group side, here's what we're hearing, and this is what Sue was saying earlier, is some of the groups, especially these delegated groups, can be really large, and they're managing information for a lot of providers across a lot of locations that they don't have a lot of regular interaction with, and it can be difficult for them to get updates themselves. And for some providers, they're really only getting updates at the time of credentialing. Second point is that most of the groups the AMA has talked to talk about their difficulties with sending rosters, the different formats that they have to support, and how often they're having to update it, the content that's included. Sue did a nice job describing some of that, some of those things that they go through, and I don't think that would be a surprise to any of you to hear that. And then, the last thing that a group wants to do is see their claims, the claims for their providers not get paid on a timely basis. They really don't want to see the payment get delayed or the claims get rejected or anything like that. So they're sometimes, maybe through a lack of understanding on how that data is being used, they're over-reporting just to make sure that they don't run into any issues on the back end. Okay. So then let's just talk about it from the payer perspective. Payers have been telling us first that most of them are receiving hundreds, or in some cases even thousands, depending on how big they are, rosters from both their delegated groups as well as their direct network groups. And then they're saying that when they get them in, and even they say, while they try to get all of the rosters coming in the same format, they don't always come in the same format. There's always, there's lots of groups that just are not complying, or maybe their contract allows for them to send it in their format. But at any rate, the payers are still having to deal with rosters in different formats. But then once they get it into a standard format, they're going to have to compare that information and apply it to their underlying databases. And sometimes that can be difficult for them. It can be a manual process, or maybe it's automated, but if there's just all kinds of things that can go wrong in that process, as I'm sure you're familiar with. And then the last point is that when they're applying the updates, they really do have to take into account not just the directory, but they also have to take into account their other business processes and the databases that depend on the provider data, such as claims, once again. So all of this can result in delayed data updates. I've heard plans say, yeah, we've got an updated roster, and it's been sitting in my inbox for 6 months, right? So there can be times when it's just slow to get those updates, or when mistakes are made. So that's part of what's going on here.
Yeah, and Dara, this just reiterates that there's administrative burden for both the payers and clinicians, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Thanks, Sue. And so really then, what are your options, right? We've talked about how this happens and how often it happens, and we've talked about CMS's point of view on being able to trust credentialing services and provider response. So, really what you're looking at for options, because at least CMS is, regardless, holding payers accountable no matter where you're getting your information from or what your processes are using. They're really not allowing an out for payers on this matter. So you can kind of look at 3 different approaches, right? You can, and we've seen payers doing all of these things, right? You can focus on tuning and improving your inbound roster handling. If you do that, you can improve your timeliness, but you are still placing your trust in these groups to provide you with up-to-date information, which is one of the things that CMS said that you can't necessarily always trust. The second thing that you can do is you can do full-scale outreach. You can send your information out to a group or ask them to come in and review the information you have from them. And some of the groups will do this, but some will just push back and they'll just tell you to refer to the roster that they're sending you. Some will work with you nicely, but some will push back, and you can understand why they would. The last approach is, as CMS suggests, you can apply analytics or machine learning, and you can use the data that's already available, and then use your findings to perform outreach in a more strategic way based on those analytics. We're actually going to look in a little bit further into point number 3. A shift in approach to leverage the data that's already available to tackle the problem in a different way. So let's look again at that same large group that we profiled earlier to see what machine learning is telling us. So we've actually been leveraging existing data, including public and private sources, claims and encounter data for quite a few years. We actually have a significant volume of claims on an annual basis that is available to us, and as a result, our customers for this type of analysis. And we keep tuning that process over time to better attack this challenge of directory accuracy. It's really changing almost on a quarterly basis. And here's some of the hot off the press type of analysis. So this group, as you recall, was listing providers at an average at 39.5 locations per provider, looking something like this. And again, to a payer who's receiving this, it's just impossible to know which ones are the right ones, okay? However, when we use our analytics against this, the real story is revealed, right? So we're actually color coding our results to our customers as a red, yellow, and green for the customers today. So let's take a look at what this group has going on. So if you look at the red, the 2 red horizontal lines, 2 of the providers listed just don't work for the group anymore. They're affiliated with a new group, or they moved on, they're doing something else. The groups that are part of this group are actually working at an average of 3.6 locations, and we can tell you which ones they are, right? You can see by the green boxes the locations where they actually are practicing. The remainder here, you can see, is a scattering of both red and yellow. The red ones are locations where we've actually received feedback from our outreach that a particular provider isn't practicing at that location, but they are still with that group. They're just active at other locations. And then lastly, this field of yellow are what we're calling coverage locations. They're locations where these providers could perform service, they could provide coverage, but they're really not going on a regular basis. And for the purposes of our analysis here, we were using a time frame of 18 months, but it is adjustable depending on how conservative or aggressive any given customer wants to be. So the net result is, of the 2,052 directory listings, 188 of them are really appropriate for directory purposes, and the remaining 94% would likely fail in the audit. But because they could provide coverage, they are valid for claims purposes. So what we're working with customers to do, the ones who have the capability, is we're suggesting that they suppress from their directory the ones that are red and yellow, but then retain the green and yellow for the purposes of claims processing. We also have some customers who are looking at using this type of analysis to supplement other existing outreach activities that they have. And you can use this same model to pare down what outreach you want to do, or to decide which stuff should be done first if you're working with some sort of limited budget. And lastly, after outreach, if you don't get response for certain provider sets, this type of red, yellow, green analysis can give you insight into what's going on. Should you keep trying, or should you recognize that they've moved on and actually terminate, so that you don't continue to go after these providers who aren't responding? Okay, so we're going to just very briefly, all of this talk has been about directory accuracy. We're going to talk just briefly about network adequacy. If payers do a really good job with addressing their directory accuracy, there's a good chance that some payers anyway will end up with some sort of network inadequacy byproduct. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it does appear that CMS is expecting this to happen. And they've actually now proposed for consideration full Medicare Advantage network reviews on a 3-year cycle starting next year, as opposed to the current reviews that are based on some sort of triggering event. So I do believe that they're anticipating this, and they're starting to put into play network adequacy reviews. So because this topic could be a webinar session of its own, I'm just going to talk about what we consider to be some of the easiest opportunities for addressing the network gaps. So in addition to using the machine learning or claims analytics to identify the active and inactive practice locations, as well as group affiliations, you can use it to identify missing locations for a contracted group or provider, or you can use it to identify missing providers for a contracted group as well. And then furthermore, you can also zero in on particular specialties or geographies where you're short to kind of fill in those gaps. So looking at this same group again, you can see there's actually down here at the bottom 5 additional providers that are performing services at these locations. And there are actually even more than this 5 that are providing services at these different locations. And I'm not sure why it is that these weren't part of the directory in the first place, right? It could be for a lot of reasons. It could be that they're not participating, or it could be that just that update process has, is lagging in reflecting new providers, or the update process that the payer is going through isn't addressing these ads properly, right? So there's a lot of things that can be done, and these would be a good first place to go to address network adequacy is, dealing with the missing information and missing providers that you have for groups that you're already contracted with. Okay, so let's just kind of wrap up here. Susan and I just thank you all for joining us, and thank you for staying with us through this session, and hopefully you found it helpful. LexisNexis and the AMA together have been working with both payers and providers to continue to look at this problem and solve it in a way that will work for both payers and providers. Like CMS, we believe that a shift really can be made to reduce the overall administrative burden currently borne by both sides through more and smarter use of the data that's already available, coupled with more precise outreach efforts to ultimately create a more reliable directory for members. Lizzie, it looks like we might have time for just a couple of questions. You want to see what we have for questions?
Yeah, we have sure. We have about 3 minutes left. So I believe Sue was going to read one of the questions that was submitted. And to the audience, if you've submitted a question and we don't have time to answer, our speakers will be happy to answer them and communicate with you directly after the live event. Sue, do you want to read one of the questions that have come in?
Of course. Thanks, Lizzie. So, Dara, here's a question from Dean Health Plans. If a provider is only seeing patients 1 to 2 times per month at one location and a directory reflects that, would CMS disagree with listing that provider at that location?
I can't speak necessarily for CMS, but if a patient can call and make an appointment with that provider, then I believe that they would pass the CMS audit for that particular location.
Yeah, and I would say that from a provider perspective, they would want to be listed as well. We should clarify, too, we also had a question here, Dara, that when you were saying provider, did you really mean practitioner?
Yes, I do mean practitioner when I say provider. Yep. And when I say, I know different payers have different terminology that they use. I'm using the word provider when I'm talking about practitioners, and then I'm using the word group when I'm talking about like an affiliation or a set of providers that are part of a practice.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, we have a few more questions here. Oops, go ahead. I think we've hit the 2 o'clock hour, Lizzie, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. It is now 3 o'clock Eastern time, and what we'll do is we'll respond to the remaining questions directly. So I want to thank you again for your time this afternoon, and be on the lookout for the post-event communications. And if you have any questions, there'll be contact information in those emails as well. So thank you. Have a great afternoon, and this concludes today's webinar.